Neighbor cuts man's tree, ends up paying millions. Michael could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He burst through the door and ran to the people in his yard. He shouted and waved, trying everything to get their attention. The man never agreed to any of this. The one who was cutting the trees stopped eventually. He looked at him, then dialed his phone and handed it over. Michael and Emma were married and lived in Nashville, Tennessee. They had just moved and wanted to make some minor changes to create a more welcoming environment in their home. There were many homes just like theirs in the area, but a part of the property they loved was comprised of oak trees that lined their yard. The trees were an important factor in their decision to buy the house. Still, they never thought they would cause them so much trouble eventually. Among those oak trees were countless mulberry trees that blocked out the sun to the home. The young family decided to get quotes around town to see who could cut them down and had no idea how bad things would get. At that point, their neighbor came into the picture. The neighbor had spent a lot of money building a front porch just before Michael moved in. He added a jacuzzi, a pizza oven, the works. Michael and Emma were actually a little jealous of their neighbor. Michael's neighbor would spend his late afternoons lying in his jacuzzi. But there was a problem. The oak trees that Michael and his wife loved so much had the opposite effect on their neighbor. The trees would block out the sun and leave his jacuzzi in the shade. It just so happened that their neighbor owned a tree felling business and asked if he could take a look at the job. Michael was just hoping that he would be charging less than the other companies. He had no idea what his neighbor's true intentions were. While Michael and Emma were out of town, his neighbor told him that he would drop a quote off in his mailbox. Michael knew nothing about tree cutting, so he just thanked his neighbor for his kindness. But just 1 week later, Michael was boiling with anger and shouting at the stranger that was in his yard. What was going on? The family had just returned from their trip to find a terrible sight. Michael was confused. He had just gotten back and heard the sound of machinery, so he went to the source. In his backyard, there were diggers and trucks. He saw that there was the neighbor's company logo on them. The workers had already started cutting down not only the trees Michael wanted to be cut, but the ones that he loved too. Michael was shouting at the workers to stop. One of them immediately noticed the man sprinting at him, so he stopped. Michael angrily asked who had given them permission to cut down the trees. Michael looked around at the disaster and asked the worker who had given the crew permission to cut all those trees. He said that his boss, Michael's neighbor, ordered the job. Michael briefly surveyed the damage and felt like crying. The family's yard was now filled with stomped flowers and fallen branches. And in the middle of it all stood the sawn-off stumps where his beautiful oaks had once stood. Michael couldn't believe that his neighbor had done this. Confused, Michael had told the worker that he never actually agreed to this kind of work being done in his yard. Immediately, the man rang his boss and handed Michael the phone. After a short heated conversation, they hung up. Michael was left with huge fallen trees and debris scattered all over his yard. This was just the beginning of the ordeal. Michael thought about his next course of action, but there was nothing he could do. He tried to confront his neighbor, but he was lying low and his phone always went to voicemail. And to add insult to injury, the neighbor left a note on Michael's porch trying to fix things. Michael had told his story on Reddit, asking for advice. He said that when he returned home from vacation, he came home to 2 tree stumps, smashed grass, and a note promising $2,000. Michael explained in a Reddit post that his neighbor really thought that he could throw money at the problem and make it go away. When Michael's wife came home, she was devastated that her beloved trees were gone, and she hated that now she could see the cars passing by on the road in front of their house. The next day the family decided to set things up with their neighbor, but they soon realized it wouldn't be that easy. There was a problem. The trees that were cut down and left messily on their land had slid onto the busy road after a night of heavy rainfall. The family woke up to the sound of cops knocking on their door. The cops had told Michael and Emma that the trees were their responsibility, so they would need to pay for the city's expense of moving the massive trees. The family explained the situation, and due to Emma being a lawyer, she could calmly avoid blame for this. But things were beginning to get interesting. Michael's Reddit post had attracted hundreds of comments in just a few days. Many users were just as furious as he was, but then one of them advised Michael to repost his problem to a more specific thread. Michael scrolled through that particular Reddit thread and couldn't believe what he was reading. Apparently, there were lawyers who specialized in arboreal arbitration. If they went that route, would that lead to a favorable outcome for the young family, or would they just be stuck in judicial limbo for years? Shortly after he moved his post to the new thread, everyone told Michael to get an arborist as soon as possible. It turned out that Michael could do something about his audacious neighbor after all. After weeks of back and forth and growing annoyance at the loss of their beautiful trees, Michael finally had a plan. The family ended up hiring an arborist to determine the value of the trees they had lost as a way to make their neighbor admit his wrongdoings and pay up. Their trees were valued at a ridiculously high price as they were rare oak trees that took hundreds of years to grow. Then the family hired an attorney, equipped him with all the knowledge they had, and told him about the overhanging bill left by the council to clean up the road. It was then that he told Michael how much he could sue his neighbor's company for. Their neighbor's mistake led to a $1.2 million lawsuit to cover all damages created by this incident, including attorney fees, road cleanup, and the value of the centuries-old trees he cut down. The neighbor declared his business bankrupt and shut it down. He sold his house and moved out of town too. Michael and his wife didn't have to pay a penny.